Rape of Nanjing by Sarah, Arleth, Tina, and Pamela.
Within this PowerPoint, we will be talking about the rape of Nanjing and why it occurred. In this slide, it is a quote from one of the few survivors. "I will never forget a memory like this." What exactly is the rape of Nanjing, also known as the Nanjing Massacre? On December 9th, 1937, a general named Matsui Iwane led Japanese troops into the city of Nanjing, China, also known as Nanking. As they invaded this Chinese city, they caused many of the buildings to be burned and looted. Not only were there burning and lootings, there were also many killing contests and pillaging. And worst of all, they killed hundreds of thousands of people, and they also raped a large portion of them. In the end, China was left to recover from these painful attacks. This is the timeline of events. On July 7th, 1937, the Sino-Japanese War begins. On August 18th, 1937, the Japanese army invaded Shanghai. On December 1st, 1937, the Nanjing mayor ordered citizens to move into safe zone. On December 9th, 1937, the Japanese army demands surrender, and the Chinese army refuses, which begins the massacre. On December 13th, 1937, the Japanese captures Nanjing, and by February 1st, 1938, the massacre had ended. Notice that many of these events were within months of each other, and the massacre lasted about 6 weeks. Let's now talk about the history of Japan and China. Let's start off with Japan. We have to realize that Japan and China always had a well-rounded relationship with each other, especially since Japan based most of their language and culture from China. Although Japan and China were very close with one another, Japan really wanted to bring their own government in and be more superior than China. So, in 1890, the Meiji Constitution was adopted, setting up a Western style of government. Within a few years, Japan was ready to fight China. So in 1894, the Sino-Japanese War began. This was Japan's first fight with China, and it was over the country of Korea. They won the war and began to think of themselves as superior than any other country, especially China. The next significant event was during the First World War, when the Japanese economy was booming. So as the World War began, Japanese were the main provider of most of the manufactured goods. This was great for the Japanese up until the Great Depression hit. The Great Depression not only hit America, but it also hit Japan in its economy, because people stopped buying their goods. Nationalism began to take hold of Japan because they believed that they were not being as respected as they used to be because no one was buying their goods. As Japan wasn't the only country that was significantly affected by the First World War, a lot of countries began to think that Japan was the Asian master race. So Japan started thinking more of themselves and wanted more land to control. So again, Japan invaded China in the city of Manchuria in 1931 after a bombing incident at a railway controlled by the Japanese. This eventually led to Japan to believe that they could invade China and take the security of it. So now we're going to be talking about China. China was once the world power, before World War I. As I mentioned earlier, China helped Japan get onto their feet as they were Japan's role model for a lot of cultural ideas. But eventually, Japan and China did not agree on such things, such as the ruling of Korea. This was their first real disagreement. China was not only disagreeing with Japan, but they were also having many inside factors and problems as well, such as the fact that they weren't united as a nation. They had also been going through opium wars, which had weakened China to its core. By 1912, the country was split up and they were constantly fighting their own people. Chinese troops were ruling over Manchuria's land, but eventually, as I said earlier, the Japanese took over. We'll now talk about the relationship progression between Japan and China. In 1952, the Sino-Japanese signed a peace treaty. In 1972, Japan and Chinese relations were normalized. And by 1978, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship was signed between Japan and China. And although they were at peace after the Sino-Japanese War, their relationship was still very strained, but they eventually improved it after the massacre. So after the Nanjing massacre, the Japanese claimed the Chinese were exaggerating their brutality. As you can see, Japan and China's relationship was very rocky. We'll now talk about the Japanese and Chinese cultures and how it affected many of their actions. As Japan and China were fighting over the city of Nanjing, Japanese military was very set on following the Bushido Code, which is to die over surrendering, because surrendering was viewed as cowardice. The actual rate between surrendering and the dead in the Japanese military was 1 to 120. It was death before dishonor in their eyes. And not only was their fighting justified in their eyes because of Bushido Code, their killings and rapings were also justified in their minds because of other cultural factors, such as the fact that they were actually not allowed to rape people, so they were just killing the people that they raped, so there was no evidence to be found. And if the Japanese military didn't kill the woman didn't even say a word of their raping because they were considered a disgrace for having sex before marriage. We have to realize that these cultural aspects were justifications for the killings and the rapings that they did to many other people. Let's now talk about the causes of the massacre, which we condensed into 3 categories. The first one, Western involvement. The second one, Sino-Japanese aftermath. And the third one, that China was weak. Let's first talk about the Western involvement. So during the war, many Japanese believed that the war was surrounded on Western involvement. People thought that the British and the Americans were brutal, and the aim of the war was to liberate Asia and to oppose to the imperialism of the US and Britain. The war was a fight against America in their eyes, and they were defeated by America, and the war had nothing to do with Asia. This is what they generally thought. But eventually, the Japanese were truly noticing the real reasons for this war. Let's talk about another cause of the massacre, the Sino-Japanese aftermath. After Japan's victory, they believed that they were dominant, leading them to heighten their ambitions of aggression and military expansion into Asia. And last but not least, they believed China was very weak. Japan wanted to increase their influence and spread into different lands and territories. And because China was beaten to the brim from corruption in multiple wars before they invaded, their country was very prone to invasion. So Japan invaded Shanghai and headed towards Nanjing, where they were trying to set a plan to save the city, but it failed. Let's talk about the foreigners. So the foreigners established a Nanking safety zone, a 2.5 square mile area reserved for civilians that were supposed to be safe from the Japanese military. But many of the Chinese soldiers hid inside that safety zone, so the military knew about that, so they justified them raiding into the zone. Japan also allowed American embassy to return to the city earlier because it wanted to stop the tension with the United States. Many civilians were also convicted of war crimes. So in the countries of Japan and China, and the countries that are connected to the West, there are many impacts from the massacre. In China, Chinese soldiers were hunted down and killed. There were many deaths in families, infants, and elders, and there were tens of thousands of women that were raped. Not only were the buildings destroyed and looted, but also the civilians were leaving the country. In Japan, the invasion lasted about 6 weeks for them. This massacre that they caused estimated a total of deaths from 200,000 to 300,000 people. The Japanese Imperial Army was also declining due to discipline and disrespect. Japan today have many Japanese officials that still deny the severity of the massacre, and they believe that it was a fabrication by China. And in the West, there was no punishment of Japan in order to safeguard relations or minimize tension. So basically, they were just overseeing what was happening, and the news was spreading everywhere else. And the Americans were just passing the knowledge, or they had little interest in Asia. So the aftermath is that the Japanese were held accountable by the United States as they stopped their trades with them and closed them off from the Panama Canal. This caused the U.S. territory to be bombed during the Pearl Harbor attack, leading to many other events in the Second World War. As mentioned earlier, we also talked about Japan today and how they believe that it was just a fabrication by China. For the most part, we have a Eurocentric history education. This massacre was often overlooked by the rise of the Nazi Party and tensions leading up to World War II. In conclusion to the question of why did the rape of Nanjing occur, there were also many other reasons beside the causes that we stated earlier. We mentioned a lot of them throughout the PowerPoint, especially in the history of Japan and China. So the ones that we discussed today were the need to be a greater power, the Sino-Japanese War aftermath, the government military officials in both Japan and China, the desire for increased influence, weakened Japan, and embarrassment. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and our next slide will be our works cited page.